Today, I am talking about relationships and happiness with David Cooley, restorative relationship process facilitator from North Carolina, USA. Hello, David, and very welcome to our Open to Happiness podcast.
Hello, Nicoletta. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. I'm very excited to have you here. So, David, before we start talking about relationships and happiness, tell us a little bit about you. Who are you and how was your life so far?
So, I'm a relationship process facilitator, and this is something that I originally started doing when I was working in the field of restorative justice. I don't know if that's a field of study that you've heard of or worked with before, but in the United States, at least, it's being used to try to help people stay out of jail and create a context in which we start to deal with crime in a way that's different than just sending people into a cell and isolating them from society. And so in that context, I was working with people who had committed crimes, hurt other people, and we're creating opportunities for the people that are responsible for harming others to sit down with them face to face and figure out how they could fix the harm, how they could repair the relationships that were damaged, and create agreements that would help people move forward. So that was a very powerful, formative experience for me. But after a few years of working at the institutional level, realized I wanted to make it more personal and
Right.
start focusing on intimate relationships, romantic relationships, family relationships, friend relationships. And so that's when I created the model, the restorative relationship conversation process that I offer now. In terms of how's my life been up to this point, it's been interesting. It's been an interesting life. It's been marked with some significant challenges. I'm 46 now. When I was 19, I was diagnosed with a severe form of autoimmune disease that I still continue to manage. It's taught me a lot about health and well-being and what it means to be healthy in a very particular context. It's also helped really prioritize a lot of things for myself, what matters most in life because of the challenges that I've had to face. I also grew up in a place where there was a lot of racial violence, a lot of racial discrimination. Um, Grew up in a place where I didn't feel safe a lot of the time, which also marked my experience. It also taught me a lot about or sensitized me to some of the realities in which we live in the United States.
Right.
Right? Culture of oppression, culture of racism, right? And what that means for us as citizens of this country. It also taught me the importance of really being open to other people's experiences. Why do people behave the way they do in extreme situations? And how are these impacting our lives and sort of the role of trauma in relationships and, seeing that from a personal, but also from a social perspective. So I feel like I've been very lucky to have experiences that have been hard, but have also really sensitized me to the importance of the relational reality in which we live as human beings.
Thank you so much for sharing this. When you mentioned the autoimmune disease, because I suffer from one of these as well, I immediately thought of trauma because we now know from researches that there is a clear link between a traumatic past or traumatic experiences, especially in our early years of life, in our formative years, and this type of diseases that we experience in adult life. So what was it like for you to go through all of these times when you felt insecure, unsafe in the environment, in the outer environment, to observe this social inequality? How do you feel that impacted you and your sense of joy and happiness in life?
I think it really impacted my sense of what was possible in terms of happiness or integration or safety, right? It really compromised my sense of what was open to me. And so there was a lot of guarding, there was a lot of shielding, a lot of protection mechanisms psychologically that were developed in order to keep myself safe from what felt like a hostile environment,
Yeah.
right? And then having the trauma of a significant chronic illness also compromised a lot of my sense of what it means to be an able-bodied person in this world, and then even a man, right? There's a lot of narratives in my culture, at least, about what it means to be a man, and a lot of those can be very limiting, right? Strength. What does that mean to be strong?
Yeah.
And if physically you can't be strong in the same way that other people can, how does that impact your sort of sense of what it means to be a man in this culture? So it's really sensitized me to some of the realities or sort of narratives that we're all sort of exposed to here in this cultural context that can be really damaging to our sense of identity. But it's also given me an opportunity to expand and explore more nuances, more avenues of masculinity, a broader sense of what it means to be a man. And I'm really grateful for that, because it now allows me to help people who are struggling with things that I was struggling with a long time ago. And so adults come to me and say, yeah, I'm dealing with this issue that just feels like I'm becoming aware of it now. And so because of my experience, I've been able to sort of process that, work on it, integrate it, and develop techniques for helping other people work on those issues for themselves. So, yeah, I feel really blessed to have had what I've had to deal with, but also sort of been brought the teachers and the experiences that have allowed me to kind of alchemize or transform my own pain or suffering into sort of systems or ways of helping other people deal with their traumas.
Wow, and that's so important for us trauma survivors, isn't it? To
Absolutely.
to extract that meaning from the pain, so it wasn't for nothing. I mean, it wasn't just suffering. It wasn't like a punishment. It was there to challenge us, to test us in a way, to help us grow and get to know ourselves, our true self, and eventually learn some lessons that are now used in the communities. And that's quite rewarding. It did happen for me in a quite similar way, so I can connect with that. So you've been, David, through some hardship, through some adversity. Has there been happiness throughout these times, or not as much?
Well, it's interesting. For me, the question of happiness has been changing a lot, especially in the last 10 years. You know, I think as a younger person, there was the idea that we're supposed to be happy, or at least that happiness exists as a possibility out there. And if we're not happy, then something's wrong. And so I was acutely aware that as a teenager and a young adult, I wasn't happy most of the time. And there was a lot of depression. And depression is something that I still have to manage. And so being aware of that created kind of a relationship to happiness where I felt like I wasn't living up to sort of the possibilities of full human life. And so I actually felt oppressed in some ways by the concept of happiness, because I wasn't sort of working hard enough or doing what was necessary to attain it, right? And so I remember carrying this kind of weighty relationship, this kind of tarnished relationship with happiness for many years. And then I had a really close friend of mine who didn't seem to care about being happy. And it was curious to me. You know, I've observed his behavior for many years, and then it occurred to me, like, to ask him, "Are you happy?" And I'll never forget what he said, and it became a really healing reframe for me around the question of what is the role of happiness in my own life. And basically what he said in response is, "I don't care about happiness." And I was very curious about that and sort of surprised, because it was such a casual and unhesitatingly affirmative dismissal of the importance of happiness. I said, "What does that mean? Why not?" And he said, "Well, happiness is just something for me that comes and goes. It's a state. It's a very fleeting state, a very fleeting experience. What I'm more interested in is cultivating inner peace or presence, the capacity to be grounded and present to whatever's happening. And when I'm doing that, often that will create, I think, what some would call happiness. But other times I'm very present to the fact that I'm not happy, and that's fine too." And so that really helped me let go of this idea of needing to cultivate or pursue or do something different, or especially be different to be happy or to
Yeah.
have happiness in my life. It was very liberating. And it was a way in which I was able to relate to the concept of happiness without feeling like it was one more thing that I was doing wrong or not doing enough
Right.
of, sort of another way of falling short in life. And so that helped me ground into a lot of the values that I had already had. Like I was easily able to connect to that idea of being present and the importance of being present in life to whatever's happening, regardless of whether it's painful or enjoyable. And so I've noticed that I think I actually experience what you could call a state of happiness more often than not, because I feel grounded in sort of what feels more under my control or more within my field of agency than creating something like happiness or trying to avoid something like depression or sadness. Mhm.
So gorgeous. In a way, you're talking about the connection with your true self,
Mhm.
being here, present with myself, with my wholeness, with all these parts of my being in union. And that's where you want to be. That's where, you feel safe, because it's the safety that you create for yourself. You manage yourself. Um, and as long as you're grounded and anchored within that true self, yes, you can take care of yourself. It's a way of actually self-care, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think
Yeah,
that's absolutely what it is. It's taking as much responsibility as I can for my own well-being. And so that's a concept that I'm very interested in is well-being, and it's something that I bring into conversations with clients, right? Where is well-being and where does it fit in your relational world? What's your nervous
absolutely.
system?
Hmm.
What does your nervous system feel like in relationship to situations or specific people? Hmm.
And it all starts from learning about your true self, from your self-discovery, because otherwise, if you're not clear around the relationship you have with yourself, how are you gonna, engage in healthy relationships, in positive relationships with the others? Because you don't know who you're bringing in that relationship. You don't know where you start, where you end, and that's very interesting. So beautiful. Now we're turning gradually into the relational work, coming close to your model of working. But before we get there, I'd like to ask, because now I have a sense of understanding what directed you into the healing world. It was your own struggle, your own need for answers. But what happened with the restorative justice? What was going on in there that you chose that line of work in the first place, that now leads you into doing some beautiful work in the personal relationships?
Well, it's interesting that influence that came from the past that I mentioned, growing up in a place, a social environment in which
Uh-huh.
there was a lot of social unrest, a lot of, inequality,
Right.
racial tension. There was a big part of me that wanted to understand why. Why did that exist? Why was that happening? And so that started to create sort of a sensitivity or a curiosity about sort of the social, political realities
Systems.
that were creating the dynamics in which I found myself on a personal level. So I wanted to understand
Yes.
sort of the macro causes of
Right.
my personal experience in that. Like why was being white a problem where I was growing up? And right, because I was a minority, racial minority in the context of school and some of the neighborhoods in which were living. And so it was interesting to have sort of a minority perspective in a social context in which actually on a macro level I was part of a majority,
Right.
where I had a tremendous amount of and still have a tremendous amount of privilege.
Yes.
And so I wanted to understand why it was a problem to be white. I wanted to understand why it was, why I was being attacked for that, and then sort of understand how that fit into a larger historical context. My parents were also part of social justice movements in the 60s and 70s. And so they also instilled in certain principles about paying attention to marginalized people's experience, right? And that it was our responsibility to be aware of these inherent inequalities in our social structure. So I think those were two of the biggest things that kind of led me into working in a system where restorative principles were explicit and upfront. I wanted to feel like I was doing something that potentially was changing the way that we related to some of these issues, some of these problems. I'm also bilingual, and so I speak Spanish, and so I was very aware too of kind of non-English speakers, or at least people who come from Latin America, what their experience was in this country, is in this country. And so I was a bilingual case coordinator for this organization in Colorado. And so having that experience and working on the front lines of the field of justice just continued to deepen my understanding of these real important issues, these inequalities, these imbalances of power, and the ways that they're just so fundamentally interwoven into the fabric of our society here. So it was really just seeing just what's happening, the influences of poverty. Why are people struggling the way that they are? You know, and going below sort of the mainstream narrative about inequality and what that means. And just becoming more and more sensitive to that, more and more just my conscience feeling a need to do something about that.
Mm-hmm. And what have you learned when you've started to ask these important questions? Why is it a problem that I'm here, a minority, in a geographical space where the majority of the population would fit as a minority within the global scale? So what kind of answers did you receive at the end of this self-inquiry? Why is the situation like this? Why is the status quo as it is?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is, and this is sort of a good lead in to the work that I'm doing around conflict, is that we need to be able to talk about our trauma. We need to be able to talk about our pain. We need to be able to talk about ruptures in relationships. We need to be able to talk about hard things without those conversations devolving into violence and more disconnection.
Right.
And so for me, it's really what I've zeroed in on is we need to be able to self-regulate ourselves when we feel activated, when we feel scared, when we feel triggered by someone else's experience. We need to be able to be self-aware enough of ourselves so we don't lose control in the context of a difficult conversation. And we need to be able to listen to another person's experience without trying to change it or fix it or diminish it or make it go away. So I'm really curious about how do we hold space for really hard conversations? And I think that's one thing that we struggle with in the United States, especially around the issue of race.
Yes.
We're not able to talk about it without it just devolving very quickly into a polarized perspective, right? For or against, white or black, right or wrong, right? And so it's this collapsing into a polarized dichotomy that I think becomes so toxic and so destructive. And so what I'm really curious about, and this is sort of the answer that I found in myself, is how do I personally contribute to creating a space where people feel safe enough to go beneath the initial triggers of conflict, below the storm of conflict, below the reactivity that comes to the surface when we feel threatened by someone else's perspective, and really get to the needs and wants that are very universal, that are very human, that are very connective. How do we get to that place, even when talking about something as inflammatory or scary as race?
No, it's not easy because you need to bypass centuries of collective trauma that some particular groups have been exposed to. And in America in particular, we're talking about slavery, which is still unresolved because you see the memory of that hurt. 15 million people, I believe, have been subjected to the slave trade, transatlantic trade throughout the years. 400 years, I mean, it's a lot, it's a huge history. And then, unfortunately, the color of the skin reminds you of those atrocities. So it's it's not being discussed as this is not a conversation that we had at the global level or the social level. It's a
Exactly.
conversation that individuals start out of their pain and trauma, out of their struggle. So we don't really manage the conflict properly as we should, as a global world today.
Right. And there's something I
With the
want to add.
knowledge, with the knowledge and the consciousness that we've managed to grasp today. Yes, please go on. So I think this is where the problem is with the social unrest and the social conflict, because we have this history. There's a lot of collective trauma that we've all somehow inherited in terms of wars and horrible things like pandemics, but there's also this cultural trauma. I call it cultural trauma because only some groups within some cultures have been affected, and that's
Absolutely.
the Holocaust, it's the slavery, it's the
Absolutely.
Native American
Genocide.
genocide.
Mhm.
This is a heavy word to pronounce,
Absolutely.
but it's real, and we're talking
Absolutely.
about tens of millions of people that have been killed. We're talking about mass killing. It's in our collective consciousness. We can't pretend it's not. So it burns every single one of us inside, whether we are the descendants of those that have been directly affected, or we are the descendants of those that have oppressed them and have obviously committed wrongdoings. We are still in this, and we don't know what to do with it because
Exactly.
there's no openness towards having this difficult conversation.
It's great. It's great. It's just it gets me excited, which is why I want to jump in before I forget that one of the main points, especially around the issue of racism in the United States, is that it's not only a question of the past, it's still going on, right? The systemic iniquities that exist in our culture are still creating the same kinds of problems, right? It's not that
Yes.
we had this past and it's now done. There's still an issue. And so there's a phrase that I like, that you can't forgive what's still going on.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so there can't be any process of restoration and forgiveness
Absolutely.
and working through trauma if there's like not sort of a stopping of the behavior that's causing the trauma. And so we can't even get to that here because we can't have this kind of conversation.
Very interesting. Mm-hmm.
Two of the lessons socially that I think we could learn from the United States are, one is what happened in the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, and then also the way that South Africa has taken a restorative approach to deal with some aspects of apartheid in South Africa. And I don't want to say that either of those governments handle it perfectly and erase the pain of those massive atrocities, but restorative processes were integrated into a state-funded program that got people, right, responsible individuals, like you're saying, the descendants of apartheid and the descendants of the victims of apartheid, right, and same thing in Rwanda, got those people together to talk about what are the collective impacts, what are the ways that we're still carrying that trauma, and so created these really big collective expressions of a restorative process that were very, very inspiring for me and had a tremendous impact. A lot of healing potential came out of those experiences. I would love to be able to do something like that in the United States.
Yeah. It's transgenerational trauma that comes through to us without asking for it, really. It's what the ancestors have passed on to us. They haven't managed to resolve it, and there needs to be a generation that says, I'm ready for this, bring it on. But you see, if it's only people, individuals here and there, and we don't create a collective force that is driving us towards clearing up a little bit the past, that's going to be difficult. But your mission is absolutely, oh gosh, it's unbelievable. I so much admire you for what you're doing. So you've started out of your pain. You're using your pain to understand what's going on, to take action, to heal yourself, and then to share all your learnings with all of the others. You're touching the communities. That's absolutely beautiful. And at some point, you decide you're going to move your focus from, the group to working with the individual. And what is this changing in your life now that you're developing this beautiful way of working with people that get into conflict, that struggle in relationships. And what is it about? How do you do it?
So it's really about getting to the place where, like I said before, we're able to talk about our needs and wants with the people that are closest to us, right? Because I think as human beings, we are fundamentally relational creatures. And so if we are talking about something like happiness or well-being, our relationships are one of the single most important determinants of that, right?
Yes.
The level of happiness, the level of our well-being is completely linked to whether or not we're relating well to the people that are closest to us. And so I think that's something that I've really become very sensitized to in my own life, right? Because I've had to really figure out what's most important to me, and landed on, after years of struggle, relationships. The answer for me is relationships. The thing that buoys me up, that makes me resilient, the thing that makes me want to keep living are these important relationships that I have. And so because of that, I've really seen that so much avoidable suffering comes from being in conflict with our loved ones. And that is a place where I want to make a difference. I don't want people to feel like conflict is inevitably disconnective or destructive. I want people to change the way that they fundamentally feel and hold conflict down to their nervous systems. I don't want you to be afraid of conflict. I want you to move towards it, right? And change your default setting, right? So that conflict doesn't feel like something that's inevitably going to tear your relationship apart, but actually make it stronger.
It's an opportunity, isn't it?
It's an
For both
absolutely,
partners to grow, to get to know
exactly,
themselves and grow
exactly,
individually and as a couple. Yeah.
absolutely.
As a relationship.
So we can create and deepen our intimacy more, I think, than any other way by handling our conflict in new and creative ways.
Can you stop here just for a second, and we're coming back to this? What are the main sources of conflict in our relationships, in your experience?
Like I said, it all comes down to sort of a feeling that, a fear essentially, that we're not going to get our needs or wants met in the relationship, right? I'm wanting more attention. I'm wanting more freedom. I'm wanting more attachment-based attunement. I'm wanting children. You're wanting a different house, right? We need and want different things, and we're afraid we're not going to get them from our partners. And unfortunately, most of us have learned to step into an adversarial posture versus a restorative or collaborative posture first. And I think this is connected to sort of the social framework that we're embedded in, at least in this country, in the United States, where criminal justice system has really trickled down into our individual consciousness and created a culture where we sort of move towards our partners as if they were on the other side of a courtroom. You're the prosecutor, I'm the defense of my needs, right? And so we start to get into a butting of heads.
Yeah.
And conflict is this thing that I have to win and you have to lose for my needs to get met. And I think we have to reprogram that and realize that actually we can move into a collaborative negotiation where we first talk about what are the needs, what are the values, what is most important here in the situation, and how do we work together? How do we invite our partners into a stance or a posture where we're working simultaneously on helping each other get what we each need.
It's a way of becoming responsible of your own role in that interaction, because this is not about winning or losing. It's about acknowledging that we all contribute to what's happening, the good and the bad, and we need to collaborate to, remove any sense of tension or struggle that we might have. So how does this restorative relationship conversation model of working actually works? What is it that you do? You're having conversations individually with people involved in conflict, or as a couple, as a group? And what do you really do with them?
So let's say it's a couple. Let's start with an example of a couple. So if it's a couple or more than a couple, let's say it could be multiple partners in an intimate
Yeah.
relationship. To me, it doesn't matter the number, but let's say we're working with partnerships and people are coming to me either sort of for two different reasons. One, they have specific rupture or ruptures in the past that continue to linger and impact or block their capacity to be really intimate or loving to the degree that they want. So they recognize that those past ruptures are still having an influence on their relational present. Or they're having sort of a dynamic issue where the communication just consistently exacerbates or make conflict worse. And so they're recognizing they need help changing the way that they're talking to each other so that they're not keep getting these kind of repetitive or cyclical conflict situations. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes it's the rupture that causes those dynamics. Sometimes it's just the dynamic, and the dynamic starts to create ruptures, right? So very often those things are intertwined, but often we sort of choose a starting point, and I let the client sort of tell me first, okay, we're here because of X, Y, or Z, and we pick a starting point. If it's the rupture, then we have a very specific container for that. Right. One session is really getting to the bottom of what we're going to be working on. I explained the protocol. The second session is we step into that space. It's a longer session where I'm inviting each person to be speaker and listener.
Right.
And they're getting the chance to talk about how they were impacted by the particular circumstances. What have been the impacts? What's the hardest part of this? What are their struggles still? Creating space for people to really say the hard things that typically they may be afraid to say alone because they're afraid the conflict's going to get worse. So in that space, obviously, I'm facilitating. And so if the language of the speaker starts to get aggressive, if it starts to become shaming, blaming, making the other person responsible for their experience, I'll jump in and I'll start to help them reframe their language in a way that can actually be heard and digested by their partner without it feeling like they're making them responsible for it, while at the same time being able to own any pain that they have. It's not a matter of not feeling angry. You can be angry, you can be intense, as long as your language isn't crossing a line. A lot of people don't know how to do that, to be angry, but also then not to attack the other person from that anger. So that's often a new skill that people learn in the context of the work with me. Then the listener is really having to learn how to self-regulate, manage their own emotions, manage the discomfort of seeing their partner sort of talk about their behavior, their actions in a way that's can make them feel shameful or afraid or threatened or angry or defensive. So how do they learn to sit with that and hold that and still be present to what the other person's saying? And so I give them a chance to work with their nervous system, be aware of their triggers as they're coming up, name them as they're coming up, noticing when they're not able to stay present and listening to their partner. We track those things in real time, give voice to those so that they can sort of work with them as they need to, so they can keep coming back to that presence that will allow them to really listen. And so after that, the listener is going to reflect back what they've heard their partner say without adding anything on top of it. I'm hearing you say this really hurt when I did what? Right. And so that's often a very unique or novel experience for some partners, to actually have what they've just said reflected back without any overlay, without any projection or dismissal or justification on top of it. Once each person's had the chance to do that back and forth, then we open it up to more of a dialogue. People can ask each other questions like, when you were talking, I heard you say this. What did you mean? Are you trying to say this? And they start to nuance the conversation. Again, all in the context of this framework of the restorative protocol. So it
So
creates
beautiful.
it creates a container of safety for them that they wouldn't have otherwise.
Right. So in a way, you're working with the individual, but also with the dynamic between the two, and they get the chance to know themselves a bit more individually and understand the impact on the other, but then get to feel the dynamic between them two, and maybe contemplate the thought of shifting this to a different kind of level. How is this restorative relationship conversation helping them differently comparing to the traditional couple relationship therapy or counseling? What's adding extra? What's its special sauce?
Good question. And so what a lot of partners come to me saying is that there's a lot of frustration around experiences in the therapeutic context where they feel like a lot of talking, but not a lot of change. This is over half of my clients say that to me when they come to me. And that's what they're looking for, something different. And so a big reason why the restorative process is different and why I originally was excited about it, taking it from the institutional level, bring it to the personal level, was I've seen it. Here is a very specific protocol. Here is a process that can be taught, that can be taken from one context to another. And the steps are relatively easy to understand. It's not a complicated process.
And it's pragmatic. It's very
pragmatic, and you can implement it immediately, right? After the first session of working with me, clients walk away with a very clear skill set of what they can start doing differently when they start to talk about conflict. And that's what I want. Ideally, I want relationships to transcend my work as quickly as possible. They stop coming to me as quickly as possible because they've gotten the tools that they need to start handling it differently. That's the ideal. I don't see you again after a few sessions because now you're doing it on your own. If I need to support you and you want to keep working with me, great. We'll keep doing it till you feel like you've got what you need, but that's not the point. The point is to really get you to the point where you've got what you need to handle conflict in a way that feels regenerative, restorative, connective. So that's really the difference, is the emphasis on changing the behaviors, the actions, the speech patterns, helping people see this. When you say this way, you're exacerbating conflict. You're making it worse. Your partner's not able to hear you and receive you and give you what you want. What if we say it this way? What does that feel like? Mm-hmm. So there's a huge focus on skills and practical techniques.
Yeah.
And agreements. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
At the end of every session, we're ideally getting to what are the agreements that you all want to make for yourselves.
I'm sensing that it's very practical, your system, your model of working. It's focused on solutions, not on the problems themselves, although there is space for looking into the problems. What's also very interesting is the fact that you're basically teaching the two actors coming into that space to be in a relational space, to learn to embrace a relational being. It's a new type of experience because no one is teaching us this. In our families, we don't really learn other than what we observe, and we naturally imitate our parents, and our experience is naturally limited to what we've seen, and it's very few people that we have around. Then the school is not teaching us much about relationships and the cultures. As we mentioned, we keep pretending a lot. We don't feel encouraged to be our true selves, just because our true selves haven't been allowed to express themselves. There's always this social pressure, question mark on, are you adjusted? Are you liked? Are you tolerated? Can you freely express your views, or there might be consequences? So that sounds really, really good to me. So how is this system of yours now helping your clients to heal relational trauma?
Well, again, like let's say we take a rupture, right? We could call a rupture a trauma. Like conflict, when it's not handled well, creates relational trauma. If I do something to you that hurts and continues to impact your capacity to be intimate with me or allow me to be close to you, I would call that trauma. And so I'm really excited by the continued efforts of people who are in the field of trauma work to expand the definition of trauma. I think we're starting to realize that we're actually subject to more trauma than we realize.
Yes.
I think in the past, there's sort of this idea that you're in a war or a car accident, and that's trauma, right? A brain injury is trauma. Very explicit or extreme cases of abuse our trauma. But really what I think we're learning is that disruptions in our relational connections are inherently traumatic if they're not dealt with in a way that allows people to really come back to each other and keep working on developing secure emotional attachments. And so this system helps people deal with conflict in a way that brings them back together so that they feel like they're collaborating on transforming their conflict into more connectedness instead of more distance and sort of an inevitable end potentially, or just discontentment if they don't separate but still stay together with these lingering hurts. And so for me, it's a way of helping people reclaim their relationships from the influence of trauma. People become the actors who are the ones who are able to transform it, as opposed to feeling victims of it or subject to conflict and the trauma that then creates.
It sounds amazing. Basically, they become the makers of their own lives. They don't, feel like spectators, like
Right.
it's happening to them, or they are watching the other, but they don't really engage themselves with the true being. Yeah, very, very interesting, David. I really love it. Can you share towards the end now, what are your best 3 learnings that you've captured over the years and you would like to share with our watchers and listeners? How can they live a happy, meaningful, and fulfilling life?
Let's see if I can come up with 3. I think the first one obviously is, what do each of us need to be able to stay grounded, stay present, focus on our own well-being as individuals, create secure emotional attachment with ourselves and with life first, right? How do we give ourselves what we need as individuals? What's missing from that equation? What do we need to do that? Like really putting ourselves in the driver's seat of our own well-being without being completely self-reliant and not being open to connecting with others, right? But really, how do we take full responsibility for our own emotional well-being? Sort of, it's more of a question, right, that invites people into sort of moving into that position for themselves. That's the first thing. The second is then, how do we use that to positively impact our relationships, right? And really see the value and importance of our relationships on that first piece, like our well-being, like really honoring our relationships, seeing them as sacred, seeing them not as disposable, right? And recognizing that we have to really take a lot of care to not fall into sort of the trap of taking our relationships for granted. It's so easy to do, especially when you're living with people and seeing them every day. How do we keep our relationships sort of imbued with a sense of sacredness and specialness? That's really important. A third thing, I think something that I'm working on is that I don't think I'm very good at is like having fun, enjoying life, doing what we do just for the sheer sake of it without having to have it be productive or turn into something else, sort of escaping the result-based focus that so many of us have. I'm just realizing for myself, wow, how much fun do I have? It's something that a growth edge for me that my 8-year-old son is really teaching me. And it's just enjoying more of these moments that we have and seeing that then sort of supports those first 2 things that I've mentioned. Mm-hmm.
I absolutely love the sound of your work. I love your philosophy of life. And yeah, I think you're doing something amazing for this world. Keep doing it. It's been amazing. It's been very, very pleasant, very enjoyable to be here in this space with you, David. Thank you so much for your time, for taking the time to be here with us and share your wisdom with everyone. Many, many thanks. Where can people find out a bit more about you?
So if they're interested in finding out more about me, the best place is to go to www.restorative.com. And so that's my website, and that's where you can find me. Send me an email there and be in touch that way. But I also want to thank you for inviting me to this conversation, and also for the work that you're doing, creating this platform for other people to get access to resources they might not have otherwise.
Thank you. Many, many thanks. All the best.
All right. Bye-bye.